In the vastness of space, there was a ship that no one ever feared. It wasn't big or powerful like the warships of the mighty fleets. It didn't shine with the gleaming lights that many ships did. Nor did it have the advanced technology that most other ships in the galaxy boasted. To most, it looked like an old worn-out relic from a forgotten era. The paint was peeling, and its hull was scratched from years of battles and missions long past. The ship had been abandoned, left floating in space with little more than a skeleton crew to keep it running. Its name was the Resolute. Once upon a time, it had been a proud ship, known for its resilience and ability to endure the toughest conditions. But over the years, as newer and more advanced ships took over, the Resolute had been pushed aside, relegated to the backwaters of space. The crew who still worked aboard it were a group of outcasts, people who had nowhere else to go, stuck on a ship that everyone had forgotten about. They kept to themselves, working in silence as they slowly became used to the feeling of being invisible to the rest of the galaxy. On this day, like every other, the crew of the Resolute went about their duties. Commander Alina Harris stood in front of the ship's control panel, her eyes scanning the data flowing across the screens. She had been captain of the Resolute for 5 years, and in that time, she had seen the ship go from being a top-tier vessel to a forgotten relic. It hurt to see the ship so degraded, but there was little she could do. The galaxy had moved on. It had no need for a ship like hers anymore. Behind her, Lieutenant John Foster worked on maintenance, his hands moving quickly across the console, fixing small issues that seemed to arise every few hours. He was young, eager to prove himself, but working on this ship didn't exactly offer the excitement he had hoped for when he joined the fleet. He often dreamed of flying a sleek, modern ship, something that could earn him a reputation, but here he was, stuck with the Resolute. It felt like a punishment. The ship was quiet, the only sound the occasional hum of the engines as they slowly pushed forward through the cold void of space. The crew members moved about, not speaking much, each lost in their own thoughts. Number 1 was excited, no one was happy. They were all just going through the motions, keeping the ship operational for reasons no one could really explain. The crew had accepted that they were no longer relevant. In the eyes of the galaxy, the Resolute and its crew were no more than ghosts. But then, something unexpected happened. A sudden blip appeared on the radar, a small object, moving quickly towards them. At first, Commander Harris dismissed it. It was probably just a passing asteroid or debris. But as the blip grew larger, it became clear that this wasn't just space junk. The ship's sensors began to beep, alerting the crew to something unusual. Commander, Lieutenant Foster said, his voice filled with uncertainty. There's a ship approaching. It's not showing up on the usual scans. I can't get a good read on it. Harris turned sharply, looking at the console. The object was now closer, and it was definitely a ship, no asteroid, no debris. This was something much more dangerous. The crew's excitement shifted to concern. They were alone out here, deep in uncharted space, far from any major fleet or help. The ship that was coming toward them had to be something formidable. Raise shields, Harris ordered, her voice steady but filled with urgency. The Resolute had powerful shields, but not the kind that could withstand an all-out assault from a top-tier ship. They had to be ready for anything. The crew scrambled into action, each member moving to their assigned stations. Harris could feel the tension rising, but there was nothing to do now but wait and see what would happen. She knew the Resolute wasn't built to stand up to a battle, but she would fight if she had to. She had no choice. The object on the screen began to grow larger. It was a ship, massive, sleek, and glowing with alien energy. It didn't match any of the known ship designs in the galaxy. Its hull shimmered with a dark, metallic sheen that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was unlike anything the crew had ever seen, and as it grew closer, the comms crackled to life. "This is the Nightfall Fleet." A cold, menacing voice echoed through the ship's speakers. "You are in violation of our space. Prepare to be destroyed." The crew's blood ran cold. The Nightfall Fleet was known across the galaxy, feared for their power and ruthless efficiency. They were an advanced military force, one that had destroyed entire civilizations with ease. And now, they had found the Resolute. The ship no one feared was about to face the most dangerous threat in the galaxy. Taris quickly assessed the situation. The Nightfall Fleet's approach was quick, and they were clearly ready for battle. But there was one thing they didn't know. The Resolute wasn't just any ship. It had something hidden, something the enemy didn't expect. "Prepare to fire," Harris said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. The Resolute might not have been the strongest ship in the fleet, but it was far from defenseless. It had survived through countless battles and had a few tricks left up its sleeve. As the Nightfall Fleet grew closer, The crew of the Resolute braced for impact. They had been underestimated for so long, but now, it was their turn to show the galaxy what this old ship could do, and they were ready. The crew of the Resolute watched with bated breath as the Nightfall fleet continued its steady approach. Every second felt like an eternity. The hum of the ship's engines seemed louder now, echoing through the empty corridors as tension mounted. Commander Harris stood at the front of the control room, her eyes fixed on the oncoming ships. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this felt different. This was the Nightfall fleet, the most feared force in the galaxy, and they were coming straight for them. "I don't like this," Lieutenant Foster muttered, tapping rapidly at his console. "Their ships are massive. I don't know how we're going to survive this." Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, she shifted her gaze to the window, where the Nightfall fleet loomed like a dark shadow, their glowing hulls reflecting the stars around them. It was almost beautiful in a terrifying way, elegant yet menacing. Their ship designs were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Sleek, angular, and built for speed, these ships were more than just vessels. They were instruments of destruction. "How long until they're in weapons range?" Harris finally asked, her voice calm, almost too calm for the situation. 10 minutes, Foster replied. "We don't have much time." The crew had been training for this. They had run countless drills, preparing for every scenario, but nothing could have prepared them for this moment. A fleet of Nightfall warships, each one equipped with devastating firepower, was now in their sights. There was no backup, no reinforcements. It was just them against a force that could wipe them out in a matter of minutes. As the seconds ticked by, the crew went into motion. Harris knew they had one shot at this. They had to make every second count, and they had to use the strengths to their advantage. The ship may have been old, but it was built for endurance. It could take a hit and keep moving. The enemy would expect a quick and easy victory. What they didn't know was that the Resolute had one last trick up its sleeve, an advanced cloaking system that had been installed years ago, before the ship was retired. It was hidden in the depths of the ship's systems, and no one had ever truly tested it. But now, it was their only hope. "We're going to activate the cloaking system," Harris said, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. "Get ready." Foster looked up, his face a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "Are you sure? We've never used it before." "We don't have a choice," Harris replied, locking eyes with him. "Do it." The seconds stretched on as Foster hesitated, then swiftly entered the commands into his console. A soft hum filled the room as the cloaking system began to power up. The screens flickered for a moment, and then, just as quickly as it had started, the ship disappeared from sight. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. "Are we ... invisible?" Lieutenant Meyer, one of the engineers, asked from her station, her voice filled with awe. "Yes," Harris confirmed. "We're cloaked, but this won't last long. We have to move quickly." The crew waited in silence, watching the dark expanse of space outside, knowing that their window of opportunity was closing fast. They could feel the pulse of the ship beneath their feet, steady and strong, as if it was alive and ready to fight. Harris wasn't sure how long the cloaking system would hold, but they had to make their move before the Nightfall fleet realized they were gone. Foster quickly plotted a course on the navigation screen. "I've got a trajectory," he said. "We'll head towards the asteroid belt. It's dense, and we can hide among the rocks." Harris nodded. The asteroid belt was their best option. The Nightfall ships wouldn't be able to scan through the dense field of rocks and debris. Spree was risky, but it was their only chance. "Set the course," she ordered. The ship began to move silently through space, gliding toward the asteroid belt. It was almost eerie how quiet it was. No weapons, fire, no alarms, just the steady hum of the engines, the only sound breaking the silence. The crew kept their eyes on their stations, waiting for any signs of detection. The tension in the room was palpable, and Harris couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. They were outmatched, outgunned, and outnumbered, but they weren't going down without a fight. Suddenly, an alert flashed on the screen, snapping everyone's attention. "Back to reality," Commander Foster shouted. "They've detected us. They're locking onto our position." The cloaking system had been good to good, perhaps. It had made them invisible to the enemy's scans for longer than expected, but now, the Nightfall fleet had finally figured out where they were. "Activate the decoy drones," Harris commanded. No, Foster quickly deployed a fleet of small, unmanned drones, each equipped with an energy signature designed to mimic the Resolute's own. The drones scattered in all directions, confusing the sensors of the Nightfall fleet. Harris hoped that it would buy them enough time to get into the asteroid field undetected. The seconds felt like hours as the crew watched the screens, hoping their plan would work. The drones scattered, their signatures blinking brightly. In the distance, for a moment, the Nightfall fleet hesitated, unsure of which target to lock onto. "We've got a chance," Harris muttered to herself, watching the ship drift closer to the asteroid belt. They were almost there. If they could make it to the cover of the asteroids, they might just survive. As the Resolute neared the edge of the asteroid belt, Harris took a deep breath. The next few minutes would determine their fate. Would they make it into hiding, or would the Nightfall fleet destroy them before they could even take cover? The game was on, and the stakes had never been higher. The asteroid belt loomed ahead, a swirling mass of jagged rocks and debris. For a moment, everything seemed eerily calm as the Resolute glided silently through space, cloaked and hidden from view. The ship's engines hummed steadily, barely making a sound, and the crew held their breath, praying they could make it to safety before the Nightfall fleet realized they'd been tricked. Harris stood at the front of the control room, her eyes fixed on the screen that displayed the dense field of asteroids ahead. The ship was barely visible, almost invisible thanks to the cloaking system, but the tension was unbearable. Every time a rock drifted too close, the crew tensed, certain that the ship would be exposed. The silence was deafening. "We're almost there," Lieutenant Foster said, his voice tight with anxiety. He had his eyes locked on the sensor readings, trying to gauge how close the enemy fleet was. "They've fallen for the decoys for now." Harris didn't respond. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The Resolute was nothing more than an old ship with an outdated crew, and they had just managed to outsmart the Nightfall fleet, the galaxy's most feared force, but they weren't out of danger yet. There were still countless ships in the Armada, and the risk of being discovered at any second was a constant threat. As the ship drew closer to the asteroid field, the path ahead became more difficult to navigate. The field was filled with floating rocks of all sizes, some as small as pebbles, others as large as entire planets. The ship would need to carefully weave through the dangerous terrain, dodging obstacles and maintaining its speed without triggering any scans from the enemy fleet. "Steady, everyone," Harris ordered, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "We need to stay on course. No mistakes." The crew focused, their eyes trained on their stations as they carefully guided the Resolute through the asteroid field. Forster adjusted the ship's trajectory, weaving between the massive rocks with expert precision. Every turn, every movement, was calculated. Every decision life or death shields are holding. Maya, the ship's engineer, reported. Her fingers danced across the control panel, monitoring the ship's systems. "No sign of detection. The cloaking system is still working." But even as they navigated through the asteroids, the crew knew that it wouldn't be long before the Nightfall fleet caught on. They had to keep moving, stay unpredictable, and remain hidden for as long as possible. Minutes passed, and the asteroid field seemed to grow more intense. The rocks grew larger, the space between them shrinking. Foster had to work harder to avoid collisions. The ship swerved and dodged, narrowly missing a massive asteroid that drifted into their path. "We're losing speed," Maya said, her voice tense. "The ship's hull is taking damage from the rocks. The shields are holding, but we can't keep this up for long." Harris's eyes narrowed as she watched the field of asteroids ahead. They couldn't afford to slow down. If they did, they would be sitting ducks for the Nightfall fleet. "Increase the power to the engines," she commanded. "We can't afford to let up now." The ship's engines roared louder as Foster pushed them to their limits, speeding through the asteroid field. But the dangers didn't end there. The crew could hear the deep hum of the enemy fleet's ships moving into position, their sensors scanning the space around them, trying to find the source of the disturbance. A sudden alarm blared, cutting through the tension. "They've found us," Foster shouted, his eyes wide with panic. "They've locked onto our position." The asteroid field had done its job, but not for long. The Nightfall fleet had recalibrated their scans, and now they were closing in. The cloaking system had bought them some time, but it was running out. The battle was about to begin. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Harris barked, slamming her fist on the console. "All crew, brace for impact." Foster yanked the control stick hard, and the Resolute veered sharply to the right, narrowly missing an asteroid the size of a small moon. The ship rocked with the force of the turn, throwing the crew off balance. The lights flickered, and alarms blared as the ship's hull creaked under the stress. "Shields are down to 40%. Maya shouted, frantically trying to stabilize the ship's systems. "We need to get out of this field, now." "Almost there," Foster grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. The asteroid field was thinning, but the Nightfall fleet was closing in fast. They had moments to escape, and the odds of survival were growing slimmer with every second. Just as it seemed they might make it out, a blinding flash of light erupted in front of them. One of the Nightfall warships had fired a massive energy beam directly at the Resolute. The ship shuddered violently as the blast slammed into the shields, sending a shockwave through the crew. "Damage report," Harris demanded, gripping the console for stability. "We've lost 2 outer engines," Maya replied, her voice strained. "We're drifting. Shields are failing." The ship veered off course, sending it careening toward a massive asteroid. Foster tried to regain control, but the damage was too great. The Resolute was no longer a sleek, hidden predator. It was a vulnerable target, stuck in the middle of an asteroid field with the Nightfall fleet closing in for the kill. "Get ready for evasive maneuvers again," Harris shouted. "We're not out of this yet." The crew braced themselves as the Resolute lurched forward, the sound of the ship's damaged hull echoing through the control room. The asteroid field was no longer their ally, it was their enemy, and with every passing moment, it seemed the walls of rock were closing in on them. The Nightfall fleet wasn't going to let them escape this time, but Harris was determined. They had one last card to play, one last hope to survive, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. "Foster, set a course for the nearest moon," Harris ordered, her voice firm. "We make a stand there." There was no time to waste. The Resolute wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The ship lurched again as another blast shook the Resolute, sending tremors through the control room. The Nightfall fleet had found their mark, and now they were closing in for the kill. The massive asteroid in front of them loomed larger as the ship drifted, struggling to maintain its course. Foster gripped the controls with white knuckles, his jaw clenched in concentration. His face was a mask of determination, but inside, panic was creeping in. The ship was crippled, the crew exhausted, and they were rapidly running out of options. "We can't keep this up much longer," Maya said, her voice laced with fear as she worked furiously at her console. "The hull's taking more damage. Shields are at 10%, and we're losing power." "We have to make it to the moon," Harris said, her voice cold and controlled, though her heart raced. The moon was their last chance. If they could make it, there they could hide, repair, and regroup. But the Nightfall fleet wasn't going to let them just slip away. Their enemy was relentless, and this time, they wouldn't be fooled by a cloaking system or a few decoy drones. "Prepare to engage. Evasive maneuvers," Harris ordered. "We need to make it through the asteroid belt and get to the moon, no matter the cost." Foster nodded, his eyes never leaving the ship's rapidly deteriorating path. The asteroid field was narrowing, but the Nightfall fleet was still hot. On their tail, the blasts from the enemy ships were relentless, coming one after the other, each strike rocking the Resolute like a rag doll in the wind. "Evasive maneuvers engaged," Foster said, pulling the control stick to the left. The ship groaned as it banked sharply, narrowly avoiding a massive asteroid that seemed to appear out of nowhere. But as they veered, the hull scraped against another rock, sending a screeching sound through the ship's frame. Sparks flew from several panels, and the ship groaned under the pressure. "We've got a breach," Maya shouted, her fingers flying over the controls. "Hull integrity at 60%. We can't take much more of this. We're almost there," Foster yelled, his voice strained. The moon was in sight now. Barely. It was small, rocky, and desolate, but it was their only hope. They had no choice but to make it. Another blast hit, and this time, the ship shuddered violently. Warning lights blinked across the control room, and alarms blared in their ears. The shields flickered out, and the ship was momentarily exposed. "Direct hit. The port engine is offline," Maya cried. "We're losing speed." Harris' heart raced as she watched the moon draw closer, the distance between them shrinking. But with every inch, the Nightfall fleet was closing in, preparing for the final strike. "Not yet," she whispered under her breath, barely daring to believe they might make it. "We've come this far. We can't give up now." Foster's hands moved swiftly over the controls, forcing the remaining engines to push forward. The ship jerked again, barely staying on course. Their path was erratic now, every turn more desperate than the last. It seemed like the asteroid field was closing in on them, the rocks multiplying, their edges sharper and more jagged. "We can't keep this up much longer," Foster muttered. "We'll crash before we get there." "We have to get through," Harris insisted, her eyes locked on the approaching moon. "Do whatever it takes." And then, a miracle. The moon loomed closer, and just as it did, the Resolute broke through the last of the asteroid field. The ship's battered frame passed the last giant rock, leaving the chaos of the field behind. The immediate danger had passed, but they weren't safe yet. The Nightfall fleet was still pursuing them, their guns trained on the escaping ship. The distance between the two ships was closing quickly, and if they didn't make it to the moon's surface soon, they would be caught in open space. There's a canyon on the moon's surface, Harris said, quickly scanning the surface. On the navigation screen, if we make it there, we can hide. They'll have trouble following us. Foster's hands moved instinctively, guiding the Resolute downward toward the surface. The moon's barren, rocky surface loomed large as the ship descended into the canyon. The ground was uneven, rocky, and treacherous, but it was the only place they could hide. They had no choice. With a final, desperate burst of power, the Resolute made a hard landing in the canyon. The ship skidded across the rocky surface, sparks flying as the underbelly scraped against the ground. For a moment, there was silence, the only sound the low hum of the engines as they powered down. The ship had landed finally, but they weren't safe. Not yet. The Nightfall fleet was still out there, and they weren't going to let them off that easily. The crew of the Resolute was battered, bruised, and broken, but they had made it this far. They had survived. For now, Harris stood, staring at the control panel. "Everyone, get to your stations," she said, her voice quiet but filled with determination. "We have to make sure this ship is still operational. We need to fix what we can, and we need to prepare. This is far from over." The crew moved quickly, rallying around their commander, determined to make their stand. They had survived the Nightfall fleet's onslaught, but they knew the battle wasn't over. The galaxy would never see the Resolute coming, and neither would the enemy. But the fight was far from finished. They had made it to the moon, but the real war was just beginning. The silence inside the Resolute was deafening. The hum of the engines had quieted as the ship lay still in the moon's canyon, hidden from the view of the Nightfall fleet above. The crew had finally caught their breath, their bodies aching from the intense battle. But they knew, deep down, that this moment of calm was fleeting. The Nightfall fleet wouldn't give up so easily. They were relentless, and sooner or later they would come looking for the ship that had managed to slip away. Commander Harris stood in the command center, staring at the dimly lit screens before her. The ship was damaged, badly, but it was still operational. The Nightfall fleet had underestimated them, and that mistake had cost them dearly. Now, the Resolute had one chance to turn the tables. But the window of opportunity was closing, and they needed to move quickly. "We need to assess the damage," Harris said, her voice steady but urgent. "Foster, get to the engine room. Maya, check the hull integrity. Everyone else, take your stations. We can't afford to rest for too long." The crew moved in unison, though their exhaustion was palpable. The adrenaline that had carried them through the asteroid field had faded, leaving behind the heavy weight of their situation. But Harris knew that if they didn't act quickly, the Nightfall fleet would find them, and this time there would be no escape. As Foster and Maya worked to assess the damage, Harris couldn't help but glance at the moon's barren surface through the ship's viewport. The landscape was desolate, a perfect hiding spot for now, but it wouldn't last. They had to move. But where? Commander Foster's voice crackled through the comms. "The engines are severely damaged. We can't get much speed with what we have left, and if we try to push them, we'll risk tearing the ship apart." Harris frowned. The engines had been their lifeline during the escape, but now, they were more of a liability. "What about the backup systems?" "They're operational," Foster replied, "but they're not built for long-distance travel. We could use them to get off the moon's surface, but we won't have much power after that." Harris bit her lip in thought. They were cornered, and every option seemed worse than the last. The Nightfall fleet was relentless, and even if they managed to escape the moon, where could they go? The galaxy was vast, but the Nightfall ships could track them down eventually. There had to be another way. Meanwhile, Maya's voice came over the comms, bringing Harris back to reality. "Hull integrity is holding at about 45%. We've got some minor leaks, but nothing we can't fix with the tools we have on board. However, the longer we stay here, the worse it will get. The Nightfall fleet will notice the missing signature soon. They'll be sending scouts, and it won't be long before they find us." Harris looked around at her crew. They were battered and bruised, but there was something in their eyes, the same fire that had kept them going through every fight. They were a team, and they weren't going to give up now. "All right, listen up," Harris said, her voice strong and clear. "We don't have much time. We're going to need to fix the engines, repair the hull as best we can, and get ready. To move, we'll head toward the Dorian Nebula. It's a vast cloud of gas and dust. If we can get inside, we'll be able to hide our energy signature long enough for the Nightfall fleet to give up. It's a risk, but it's the only chance we've got." The crew nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The Dorian Nebula was a dangerous place, filled with shifting ion storms and thick clouds that could tear apart even the most advanced ships. But it was also a perfect hiding spot. If they could make it there, they might just have a shot at surviving long enough to plan their next move. Maya turned back to her station. Already working on patching up the ship's hull, Foster returned to the engine room, and Harris followed, ready to lend a hand where she could. The next few hours were a blur of frantic work. The crew worked tirelessly, not speaking much but moving with purpose. Every decision was critical. Every repair, every adjustment, could mean the difference between life and death. By the time the repairs were complete, the ship was a patchwork of makeshift fixes and emergency systems. The engines were still damaged, but they were functional. The hull had been reinforced as best as possible, but they would have to be cautious on their journey. The Resolute wasn't the sleek, powerful warship it had once been, but it was still the Resolutant that meant something that as the crew took their positions. Harris felt a surge of determination. This was far from over. The Nightfall fleet might have underestimated them once, but they weren't going to make that mistake again. The galaxy had no idea what humanity was capable of, and the Resolute was going to show them. Foster, power up the engines, Harris ordered. Maya, bring the shields online. We're leaving the moon. There was a brief silence, and then the hum of the engines roared to life. The ship vibrated as it slowly began to lift off the surface of the moon. The ground trembled beneath them as the ship struggled to gain altitude, but the crew didn't flinch. They had made it this far, and now they were going to push forward. The ship moved slowly, its broken engines barely enough to get them off the moon. As they ascended, Harris watched the surface of the moon shrink beneath them. The Nightfall fleet was still up there, but for now, they couldn't be seen. They were out of sight, for the moment. Course set for the Dorian Nebula, Foster said. We've got a long way to go, but we're on track. Harris nodded. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had a chance. As the ship glided toward the nebula, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, but it wouldn't last long. The Nightfall fleet was still out there, and the fight was far from over. But as long as the Resolute still flew, there was hope, and Harris wasn't about to give up on that. We've come this far, she whispered to herself. We'll keep going, no matter what. And with that, the Resolute moved into the vast, dangerous unknown, the crew ready to face whatever came. Next, they weren't just surviving, they were fighting, and that was all that mattered. The Resolute floated through the dark expanse of space, its battered hull barely holding together after the brutal assault from the Nightfall fleet. The crew was exhausted, but the silence inside the ship was a welcome relief from the chaos of the past few days. They had made it this far, but Harris knew that their journey was far from over. The Dorian Nebula loomed ahead, a cloud of gas and dust that could conceal their ship from enemy sensors. But it was also a deadly place, filled with ion storms and unpredictable phenomena. We're almost there, Foster said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. He was piloting the ship carefully, avoiding the worst of the turbulent space surrounding the nebula. But the engines are running at only 30% power. We can't afford to get stuck out here. We'll make it, Harris replied, her voice filled with quiet determination. Just keep the course steady. We need to get inside that nebula before they find us. The crew was silent, each person lost in their thoughts. The Nightfall fleet had been relentless, tracking them across the galaxy and pushing them to the brink of collapse. Every moment of peace felt like a gift, but they knew it couldn't last. Soon the fleet would realize they had been duped, and the hunt would begin again. But for now, they were safe. For now, they could breathe. As the Resolute drew closer to the nebula, the tension in the control room began to build. The nebula was a massive, swirling mass of gas and dust, its clouds thick enough to obscure even the most advanced sensors. But it was also a dangerous place. The gas storms could tear apart a ship if they weren't careful, and the strange gravitational anomalies could send them off course. It was a gamble, but it was their best shot. Shields at full power, Maya called out from her station, her voice steady as she worked to reinforce the ship's defenses. We'll need everything we've got to survive the storms inside. Harris nodded. Make sure the hull integrity holds. We can't afford any more damage. The ship entered the nebula, and the surroundings shifted from the emptiness of space to a murky, swirling cloud of colors. The dark gas clouds closed in around them, and the ship's instruments began to flicker. The sensors went dark for a moment, then scrambled back to life. The Resolute was flying blind, relying on their own instincts and the limited data they had on the nebula's dangerous terrain. Foster's hands moved swiftly over the controls as the ship navigated through The dense clouds. The ship jerked suddenly, throwing the crew off balance. A low hum filled the room as they passed through an ion storm, its electrical energy crackling around the ship. The shields flared, glowing bright as they absorbed the energy, but it wasn't enough to keep the turbulence from shaking them. With losing stability, Foster shouted. The gravity's shifting. We're being pulled off course. The ship groaned, its outer hull creaking as the pull of the nebula's gravity wells tugged at it. Foster fought to regain control, but the ship was already straining, the engines sputtering and failing to provide enough thrust. We need to get out of here, now, Maya cried. The storm's tearing us apart. Harris could feel the pressure mounting. The ship was losing altitude, and they were plunging deeper into the heart of the nebula. They were surrounded by the thick clouds, and every movement seemed to make things worse. The Nightfall fleet was still out there, and they couldn't afford to be trapped here, exposed to the dangers of the nebula. We have to break through, Harris barked. Push the engines to full power. Foster, Commander, if we push any harder, the ship could collapse, Foster warned, his voice tight with fear. I don't care, Harris said, her voice hard with resolve. We're not dying in this cloud. We push forward. Now. Foster hesitated for a moment, then slammed his hand on the control panel. The engines roared to life, sputtering but gaining power. The ship lurched forward, fighting against the forces trying to pull it under. The storm raged around them, but Harris could feel the ship slowly gaining speed. For a moment, everything seemed to blur. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as the ship tore through the turbulent gas clouds. The ship groaned, the hull screaming in protest as it was battered by the forces inside the nebula. Sparks flew from the control panels and warning lights flashed all around them, but the ship held together. The crew held their breath, trusting the ship and each other. Finally, after what felt like hours, the ship broke through the worst of the storm. The dark clouds of the nebula parted, revealing a clearing where the stars could be seen again. The ship had survived, but just barely. The nebula's dangerous grip had loosened, and now they had a moment to breathe. We made it, Foster said, his voice ragged with relief, but Harris knew it wasn't over. The Nightfall fleet would still be searching. They were in the clear for now, but they couldn't let their guard down. They had to keep moving, keep hiding, and most of all, they had to stay one step ahead. Status report, Harris ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos they had just endured. The shields are holding, Maya replied, her fingers flying over the controls as she ran diagnostics. But we've sustained more damage. The engines are running at 40% power. The hull's integrity is at 50%, and we have several leaks. We'll fix what we can, Harris said. But we can't stay here for long. We need to get to a safer location somewhere we can make repairs and plan our next move. Foster checked the navigation panel, and his face tightened as he scanned the system's map. There's a station in the nearby sector, he said. It's a small, abandoned outpost, but it's out of the way. We can use it as a base to make repairs and lay low until we figure out what's next. Set the course for the station, Harris said, her voice firm. We're not out of this yet, but we've survived, and that's all that matters. As the Resolute drifted through the vast emptiness, the crew was silent, each person lost in their thoughts. They had made it through the storm, but the fight was far from over. The galaxy was vast, but so was their will to survive. As long as they had each other, they would keep fighting, they would keep surviving, and when the time came, they would strike back. The cold silence of space surrounded the Resolute as it drifted toward the abandoned station, the battered ship still holding together despite the damage it had sustained. The crew was weary, their bodies aching from days of constant repairs, evasive maneuvers, and near-death experiences. The strain had taken its toll, but the fire that kept them going, that kept the Resolute alive, was stronger than ever. They had survived the Nightfall fleet's relentless pursuit, outsmarted them at every turn, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, they had a moment to breathe. Harris stood by the viewport, staring out at the vast emptiness of space, watching as the station grew larger in the distance. It was a small, forgotten outpost, nothing more than a scrap of metal and old technology that no one had bothered to reclaim. But it was all they had, and it was the only place where they could regroup and plan their next move. Harris wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running, but she knew that they couldn't afford to stop now. The Nightfall fleet was still out there, hunting them. They had to be ready for whatever came next. As the ship approached the station, Maya's voice broke through the quiet. Commander, the hull's holding up, but we've got leaks in multiple areas. We'll need to patch them up before we can make any real repairs. Harris nodded. We'll fix what we can. For now, Focus on the engines and shields. We need them working at full capacity if we're going to survive another encounter with the Nightfall fleet. Foster spoke up from the cockpit. Will be docking in 5 minutes. The station's systems are offline, but we can use the old docking ports to connect. Good, Harris replied, turning to face the crew. Once we're docked, everyone needs to get to work. We don't have time to waste. The ship's engines groaned as the Resolute docked with the station, the metal shrieking against the station's rusted walls. The connection was secure, and the ship's systems flickered to life. Though weakly, the station's lights were dim, and the atmosphere inside was stale, as if no one had set foot here in years. But it was enough. The crew moved quickly, gathering their tools and heading toward the station's maintenance bays. There was no time for rest. As soon as they stepped off the ship, they were met with the smell of old machinery and dust. The station's interior was a labyrinth of hallways and rooms, each one filled with outdated equipment and forgotten technology. Harris led the way, her mind racing with thoughts of what had happened in the past few days. They had been lucky, no, more than lucky. They had been smart. They had fought back when the odds were against them, and now they were here, on this deserted station, with a chance to recover. But Harris knew that this was just a brief respite. The Nightfall fleet wouldn't give up. They would find them, and when they did, there would be no hiding. We'll need to access the station's mainframe, Harris said, turning to Maya. We need to get the communications systems online. If we can't contact anyone, we'll be isolated. The Nightfall fleet will have no problem picking us off. Maya nodded, already heading for the terminal. I'll see what I can do. It's old tech, but I should be able to get it running. As Maya worked to restore the station's communication systems, Foster and the rest of the crew set to work on the ship. They began by sealing the leaks and reinforcing the hull. Each repair, each patch was done with the knowledge that it might be their last. The tension was thick in the air, but the crew was determined. They had survived the Nightfall fleet once before, and they would do it again. Hours passed, and the crew worked tirelessly, the station's dim lights flickering overhead as they fought to keep the ship and the station's systems intact. Harris moved between them, offering words of encouragement when she could, making decisions when it was necessary. But even as she worked, her mind never stopped racing. Every decision they made now was critical. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Finally, Maya's voice broke the silence. Commander, I've got the comms back online. It's not much, but we've got a signal. We can send out a distress call. Harris walked over to the terminal, her eyes scanning the data. There was no doubt about it, the Resolute was in a precarious position, but now, they had a chance to get in touch with someone, anyone, who might be able to help them. We'll send out a signal to the nearest fleet, Harris said. If they pick it up, we might have a shot at getting reinforcements. Foster looked up from the console. But if the Nightfall fleet is still looking for us, they'll intercept the signal. We could be walking straight into another trap. Harris nodded. He was right. But the alternative was sitting here, waiting to be found. They needed a plan, something bold, something daring. We don't have much choice, Harris said. We send the signal. If help arrives, we fight. If it doesn't, we keep running. We can't stop now. Maya worked quickly, sending the distress signal into space, hoping that someone, somewhere, would hear it. The crew gathered around, waiting for any sign of a response. It was a gamble, but it was all they had. And then, the station's system came to life. A voice crackled through the speakers, faint but unmistakable. This is Captain Jaron of the Aurora fleet, the voice said. We've received your distress signal. We're en route to your location. Hold tight. Help is on the way. The crew erupted into cheers, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Harris felt a surge of hope, real hope, like a light breaking through the darkness. All right, Harris said, her voice firm. We've got a shot. Get ready, everyone. The real fight begins now. As the crew worked to prepare for the incoming fleet, Harris stood at the station's window, staring out into the void. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that they might just make it. The Nightfall fleet had underestimated them before, but now, they had allies. Now, they had a chance to turn the tide. And this time, they wouldn't be running. They would stand and fight. The battle was far from over. But Harris knew one thing. They would not go down without a fight. Not this time.